Welcome to tonight's webinar, Profiles in Courage. Dr. Richard Bosshardt stands up to the American College of Surgeons. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening. And I'd like to introduce you to Richard T. Bosshardt. He's a plastic surgeon in private practice in Tavares, Florida. Dr. Bosshardt received his degree in biology, his bachelor's degree in biology, I should say, from the University of Miami, magna cum laude. He then attended the Leonard Miller School of Medicine of the University of Miami, graduating in 1978. He completed a general surgery residency at the U.S. Naval Hospital in Oakland, California, where he served in the U.S. military, during which time he was general surgeon of the United States Naval Hospital in Okinawa, Japan. And he obtained his board certification from the American Board of Surgery in 1985. Dr. Bosshardt relocated to Lake County, Florida in July of 1989 as the first plastic surgeon in the entire county. He obtained lifetime certification by the American Board of Plastic Surgery in 1991. Now, since starting in private practice, Dr. Bosshardt has participated regularly in overseas medical missions to provide reconstructive surgery to children with cleft lip, cleft palate, and other problems. His travels have taken him all over the world to the Philippines, Guatemala, Peru, Brazil, Venezuela, the West Bank, and Mexico. He performs both cosmetic and reconstructive plastic surgery in his practice. So, as you might be able to tell from what I've just shared with you, Dr. Bosshardt is a dedicated and accomplished professional. He's a surgeon who's been a member of the American College of Surgeons for 25 years, I believe, which is what makes the story he's about to tell so painful and heartbreaking. In June of 2020, following the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, Dr. Bosshardt's life and his career changed forever. Since that time, he has witnessed sweeping, dramatic, and even terrifying changes in the medical profession that undermine the values he's been taught and trained to embrace as a doctor. Tonight, Dr. Bosshardt is going to share with us how race essentialism has contaminated the medical profession, how it's influencing the quality of care doctors provide patients, and how it's breeding mistrust in the doctor-patient relationship. So, Dr. Bosshardt, and I'm going to call you Rick from here on if you're comfortable with that.
That'd be great. Thank you.
That'd be great. Rick, why don't you start by taking us back to March of 2019, when you first heard the term diversity, inclusion, and excellence in your profession in a lecture from a colleague, Dr. Olga Jonassen. So can you tell us about that lecture, what your takeaway was, and how you responded?
That particular watershed moment actually came from looking at an issue of the Bulletin of the American College of Surgeons. So just to provide a quick background, and I'll say ACS, I don't have to keep repeating American College of Surgeons. The ACS is the largest, oldest, and most venerated organization representing surgery and surgeons, founded in 1913. I have been a fellow in the ACS for over 30 years. It's considered to be an honorary thing to be an FACS surgeon, because what you're doing is you've taken an oath and you've committed to the highest standards of excellence in surgery, and I've always been very proud to have that FACS after my name. I had that for all the years that I've been in practice, and didn't really have too much active engagement in the ACS because I was so busy. I was a busy surgeon. My specialty in plastic surgery led me to spend a lot of time with my specialty organizations, and I also was very active in my local medical community as the president of the local medical society and chief of surgery at a hospital, plus having a family. So I'm practicing happily away, and I see the bulletin of the ACS, and there is a transcript of a lecture. It's a named lecture, the Olga M. Jonassen lecture. And the lecturer that was invited was not a surgeon. It was Dr. Reed from Harvard, who was a pediatrician and was the director of diversity and community outreach or some such thing. And the lecture was titled Diversity, Excellence, and Inclusion. And that caught my eye. So I didn't hear her give the lecture, but I read the transcript word for word. And the thing that immediately came to my attention was that although excellence was in the title, it was not mentioned once in the actual lecture. It was all about diversity and inclusion. And so I wrote a commentary that was published in the next issue of the bulletin, a long commentary. There were 4 surgeons who commented. We were all in complete agreement of concern about this. The others wrote a sentence or two. I wrote 2 paragraphs because I'm a writer and I like to write. And I basically questioned the elevation of diversity inclusion over and above excellence in the practice of surgery. And I have no idea what kind of reception that got. I never got any feedback on it. And things went along until 2020. And what happened in 2020 was that you had, of course, George Floyd. Everyone remembers George Floyd. And there was this national rush to embrace the idea the U.S. was a systemically racist country and that we had to make some radical changes. And so everybody from the ACS on to, corporations, other organizations went out of their way to signal their support for this concept that we have a racist country and need to fix it. And the fix it in the ACS took the form of a task force on racism, which was assembled within weeks of the George Floyd murder. And that was in June of 2020. Of course, you'll remember a little thing called COVID during that time. So that was made for an interesting year. The task force came out with their recommendations in November, which they published in the bulletin. And what really was shocking to me was that the task force basically said that they were assembled to deal with the issue, I can't recall the actual word, issue, problem, whatever, of structural racism in the ACS. It wasn't a question of if there was, this was assumed that there was structural racism in the ACS and that racism infused surgery and surgeons. I've even heard some of the leadership in the ACS, I've heard this personally, so it's not secondhand or third hand, express the idea that perhaps minority, in this particular instance, they were talking about Black patients, minority patients might do better in their outcomes if they had Black surgeons. I mean, right off the bat, this is such a terribly toxic idea that I couldn't believe that the organization was espousing something like this. And so I objected, and I sent a letter, again, I'm a writer, to the newly installed president, in which I protested this idea that surgeons are racist and would treat patients in some sort of a biased or prejudiced manner. I felt that the adoption of these concepts in the ACS was going to be very counterproductive. And I should mention that over the course of the year and a half since the March 19 and then all the way up to now, I'd been learning and studying about DEI and anti-racism. And I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty darn well informed about it. And so I knew a lot about this. And I said that if I felt the ACS was continuing to embrace this illiberal idea of systemic racism within the college, I could not support that, and I would drop my fellowship. And that was the only threat that I could make, was to quit. So I sent the letter to the president of the ACS and received no answer, not an acknowledgement or not an answer to my letter. At that point, I thought, well, what can I do now? I'm just one guy, I'm a little guy in a relatively small community, one of 84,000 member surgeons in the ACS. And I have a blog like everybody these days. So I put a little thing in my blog that basically said that I could not, I could not agree with the direction of the ACS. And if this continued and there wasn't a change in that direction away from all this DEI and systemic racism ideas, that I was going to drop my fellowship. And so in order to see about getting a little bit more engagement, I posted this on the discussion forum for general surgery in the ACS. They have an online discussion forum that surgeons can go to and communicate with each other. We can share cases and share information. discuss all sorts of topics in surgery. And so I went to the forum and I posted this this link to my blog and said, I see no choice but to leave the ACS if this continues. This led to a comment thread that ultimately topped out at nearly 1,000 comments. It almost broke the discussion threads. There was so much engagement on it. There were a total of, I think, 75 different individual surgeons who ultimately commented on that. And it ran from April until August of 2021. There's never been anything close to that in the ACS. And over time, I carefully went through the thread, and I realized that 2/3 of the surgeons who commented were in agreement with me, very concerned about this. And my comment, my basic premise on the thread was, admit what you're doing, tell us why you're doing this, where is the racism, give us the evidence, if there's a problem, let's deal with it, but let's just say that surgeons are racist and the ACS is racist. And I said, you're infusing critical race theory and DEI and anti-racism, and they denied. They even came out and said that their DEI is different than everybody else's DEI. I mean, come on, this is absurd. I mean, the gaslighting was incredible. I could not get a straight answer from the membership, from the leadership. 2 or 3 of the regents actually weighed in on the thread and didn't have much to say. No one could actually say you're wrong, but they kept beating around the idea that this is what they were doing. Well, the long and short is this: those threads only have a certain life expectancy. They run their own. They kind of slowly die out, and I was content to do that. I'd done what I could. And while I was trying to debate what to do next, the ACS leadership reached out to me. And again, I'm Rick Bosshardt, little plastic surgeon in Lake County, Florida. And I got a email from the General Secretary, Tyler Hughes, that we'd like to invite you to a Zoom call with the leadership to discuss this. And I said, great. I said, wonderful. The Zoom call took place in March of 2022. And I invited a colleague to join me. It was 5 of us on the Zoom call: the General Secretary, Tyler Hughes. Pardon me, I have a tickly throat. Tyler Hughes, the General Secretary. Dr. Bonnie Mason, their newly hired Director of Diversity in their newly established Department of Diversity in the ACS. And Dr. Tim Eberly was one of the Board of Regents, and myself and my colleague Celia Nelson, who happens to be a general surgeon. And I got to admit, I did this on purpose because I needed some really good backup and some legitimacy. She happens to be a female Black general surgeon, and she was very supportive of me because we're friends and colleagues in my community. We had a very good civil conversation. I mean, I posed my position. Celia stated her position, which basically agreed with me. The regent was clueless. Tim Eberly was clueless. He had no idea what we were talking about. And Bonnie Mason, she's the social justice warrior in the group. But it was a very civil conversation. We never came to any kind of an agreement, but we agreed that more conversation was certainly appropriate and indicated. I left that Zoom call very encouraged, thinking, okay, finally, we're getting somewhere. We're getting some engagement from the leadership on this very contentious issue. And I was waiting to see what the next step would be. Next thing I know, the two things happened in very rapid succession. One was the rules of engagement and the online communities were changed drastically. Tyler Hughes came out and said that they would no longer permit any non-clinical discussion on the clinical forums. My discussion thread was on the general surgery forum. So he said, you will have to go to the diversity forum. Well, to me, this is like taking your lecture from the auditorium to the broom closet downstairs in the basement, because nobody goes to that particular forum. I protested, and several other surgeons protested that. All of our comments and protests were taken down and they were deleted. They were not put up. And next thing I know, I could not access the communities. I would go online and I tried to get in and I was blocked. And I thought at first there was a glitch in the website. They were redoing some things on the website. Like I gave it a couple of weeks thinking that, oh, this is just a technical glitch. Well, it wasn't getting better. Finally, I emailed Tyler Hughes, who is the guy that was editing or overseeing, chaperoning, I thought, the communities. And I said, Tyler, what's going on? I can't get on. He says, oh, and this is one of those, oh, by the way, you're permanently blocked from access to the communities. And I said, what? Why? And he said, you're being blocked because of your continuous use of disrespectful language and your persistent posting of non-clinical comments on the clinical forums. And I said, my goodness, I said, show me some examples. Show me things that I commented that justify a life. This was a lifetime ban, mind you. Justify a lifetime ban. I've made that request at least a half a dozen times at various in the leadership. I have never received a single response about anything that I said that was considered disrespectful or such a blatant non-clinical comment. One of the things that's interesting is they're saying that I was posting non-clinical material in the clinical forums, but one of the premises of the ACS in adopting DEI and anti-racism is that it has a bearing on outcomes in surgery, that outcomes for minorities and for Blacks are not as good as for white patients. And this is due to systemic racism in medicine and in surgery. So here they're, on the one hand, they're saying that racism in the ACS has a detrimental effect on outcomes in surgery, yet the discussion of racism in the ACS is not a clinical issue. It should not be discussed on clinical forums. So I was banned. I appealed to the Board of Regents saying this is unfair. I would like to have and I should add, it would make sense to me to block me from the discussion forums. I can see the sense in that from their position. They also blocked me from access to the members directory. I can't even open up the directory of membership in the ACS and access it. And the really crazy thing is I can't even get my private messages. People can't privately message me. I can't privately message them. So I'm literally isolated. Silence, blocked, isolated, call it what you will, cancel, deplatform, everything you can think of to make sure that I have no engagement in the ACS whatsoever. But they left my fellowship status intact. They didn't expel me because I think they were afraid of what would happen if they did. So that's where I am. The Board of Regents denied any appeal process. The ACS has a central judiciary committee, the purpose of which is to deal with disciplinary matters in the ACS. If you have a surgeon who's misbehaving in some manner, that misbehavior can be presented to the judiciary committee for an investigation, and they will investigate, adjudicate, come up with either a discipline or they'll exonerate the surgeon. But if there is a discipline, that goes back to the Board of Regents, and they're the one that enact the discipline. Well, number one, the surgeons is to be informed that this is taking place. Number two, the surgeon is supposed to be provided a hearing in order to provide a defense for themselves. Number three, the punishment is not supposed to be enacted until the board, until the fellow member is notified. None of that happened. My ban never went beyond the Board of Regents. It never went to the committee. And this is what was, I would say, the last straw. I went to the head of the Judiciary Committee and I said, you know, you all were bypassed. I have a lifetime ban. You all have been bypassed, and I demand a hearing to defend myself. I've never been given due process, never been told what I said that justified a lifetime ban. And this is what he told me. He said, because your ban was not brought to our committee, it is not considered a disciplinary matter. So you have no right to a hearing. So, and I was told by the executive director, Patricia Turner of the ACS, that I had received due process. So at that point I said, okay, I'm going public with this because I don't have any further means of appeal to deal with this. And that started my little sideline career, if you will, of putting out opinion pieces and articles. I have been very fortunate so far that I've had some success with this. I got an article in the Wall Street Journal, the City Journal, National Review, and I've gotten the word out. I was invited on Tucker Carlson. That was my first time ever on any kind of a a live interview. Oh my gosh, talk about sitting in the studio looking at a red blinking light and you can't see who you're talking to. And that, unfortunately, was kind of rushed. I didn't have my points in place. And so even Tucker at the end said, we have to cut you short. I'm so sorry. This is an important topic. I'll come back to you. And of course, 2 weeks later, he gets canned. I was on Dan Bongino just a week or two later, and next thing you know, he gets canned. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, is it me? Is this do I have this kind of an influence on these poor people that I'm on these shows with? But that's where I stand. I remain canceled and isolated. The ACS has stonewalled. They don't answer my emails. Do No Harm, an organization that has had a tremendous amount of success in pushing back against DEI and these issues in medicine, sent a long letter to the ACS, and laid out my case and demanded I be reinstated. That letter was not responded to. And at present, there is a letter at the ACS, because it was sent out well over a week and a half ago, from FAIR, from you all. And I appreciate this. The support FAIR has given me has been tremendous. And even just this webinars is just more than I ever expected. But an attorney sent a letter, as only an attorney can. I mean, you can't, if you want to really send something threatening, you got to get an attorney to help you do it. But he laid out the violations of the ACS of my free speech rights and even my civil rights. Even though it's a private organization, what's interesting is that the ACS depends on federal grants for graduate training programs in surgery. So they do have they are required to abide by federal regulations, including the Civil Rights Act, which says you cannot, discriminate against people based on their, their ideology, their position, their race, whatever. So, I mean, he sent a very nicely worded letter, which we're still waiting for a response on. And that's where I am today, talking to you all, sharing my story.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Rick. It sort of reminds me a lot of some of what I've been hearing, just sort of anecdotally, on forums and on Twitter. But I really haven't had a chance to connect with any medical professional directly. So it's interesting to hear your personal story that affirms so much of what I've been hearing. It's interesting. You say that, I was reading your op-eds, in particular the one in the Wall Street Journal, and you say that the ACS leadership has essentially declared, and you said this again just now, it's essentially declared that the organization itself is structurally racist, which is weird to hear an organization admit to being racist. And you say that ACS leaders have even gone so far as to suggest that poorer outcomes in Black patients after surgery might be due to racism, and that I found this incredible. Black patients might fare better if they are operated upon by Black surgeons. So the assumption seems to be that racism exists solely based on the disparities and the representations of Blacks in the ACS and some sort of allegation of racial disparities in surgical outcomes. And I know you've asked for proof of this, but have any other medical professionals that you know of demanded evidence to support the allegation that white surgeons treat patients of color differently than they treat white patients?
I don't know of specific individuals that have made that kind of a request. I'm sure it's been done. I'm sure it's out there. I know that there are some people that have referenced studies that purport to show that outcomes are worse and again, we're talking, usually it's a Black-white issue. I mean, you can talk about other demographics, Asian, Hispanic, and so forth, but the issue seems to be predominantly polarizing and present in the Black-white binary. But there are people citing studies that say that, Black babies do not do as well under the care of white obstetricians, and that women, pregnant women don't do as well with white doctors. And every time I've seen one of these studies, and mind you, I'm not an academic surgeon. I'm a community surgeon. I'm intelligent. I'm well read. I'm experienced, but I'm not doing research, and I'm not up on all the details of how you parse out a study to determine if it was properly done, properly set up. properly interpreted. But every time I've seen one of these studies that purport to show that there are these racial biases, when you go and you start looking, and I have done this, you find these studies are absolutely just fraudulent. I mean, they're flawed from the get-go. They're flawed in the way they're established. They're flawed in the way the data is collected. They're flawed in the way the data is interpreted, and they're flawed in the conclusions that come around to this. Basically, they're being done to meet a predetermined conclusion, and that's how it's done. I'm a big fan of a hemoncologist at the University of San Francisco, Vinay Prasad, who has a very popular podcast, and he also has one of his own and one called Sensible Medicine. And he's taken a couple of these studies and absolutely just ripped them apart for bias and prejudice and so forth. So there's a constant push to show the effects of racism in surgery, and no one's been able to do that. I mean, it's just not there. I just finished reading. I've had a book for a while by Stanley Goldfarb, who is the founder of Do No Harm, called Take to Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns. And he goes in there and talks about these things specifically, and the absence of any, reputable studies that have been verified and, backed up by other studies that support this. So you are certainly aware of what's been going on recently with respect to the whole DEI industry. A lot of DEI people are being laid off in corporations and universities because they're not pulling their weight. The programs are not doing what they're supposed to do. They cost a lot of money. In many cases, they've been counterproductive in fomenting division as opposed to inclusion and unity. This is happening in a lot of different places, and Black Lives Matter has basically imploded. Their co-founder, Patrice Cullors, is being investigated for misuse of millions of dollars of funds that were donated to Black Lives Matter, which has never done anything in the way of anything meaningful to support, pulling up the Black community. And now you have Ibram Kendi, who is the author of Anti-Racism and collects, $20,000 to $30,000 fees for speaking for an hour, who was made the head of the Center for Anti-Racism Research at Boston University. And they're trying to figure out what happened to $48 million donated to that organization, which has been in place for 3 years and has not produced a single piece of original research in all that time. Despite that, the ACS continues to double down on DEI and anti-racism. If you look at their recent annual clinical congress, which was just held in Boston a couple of weeks ago, you look at the syllabus for their educational courses. Those courses on teaching surgeons about implicit bias, how to implement anti-racism into your practice. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. And this is in a professional organization of surgeons, for Pete's sake. So yeah, I mean, they bought into this big time. But I think the membership, if they knew about this, if this was more widely appreciated, number one, that this is being done. Number two, what the significance is, because a lot of people have not educated themselves, which is part of what I've been trying to do. If they saw this, I think there would be an uprising in the ACS to change the leadership. I think that's what we need. We need to get rid of the current leadership and bring in new people that will restore the ACS to its original mission. The mission of the ACS since 1913 has been to heal all with skill and fidelity. And you can use the word trust for fidelity. And that's the way I've always practiced. And that's why I've always been so proud to be in the ACS. And I don't know how you can add to that. I mean, to say that you have to heal all according to their identity groups and to make sure that you have a certain proportionality to representation in the ACS. As you said, Monica, it all comes down to representation and disparities in representation, because it's not Blacks are not represented exactly 12% in the ACS like they are in the United States. That is proof of systemic racism in the ACS, and that's a bunch of bunk.
As you're talking, it made me think about my dad's experience with cancer recently. So this was 2 months before the COVID-19 pandemic, and he was diagnosed with cancer. And he's obviously Black, and he's 82. He's an old guy. And his surgery was
Well, he's not
scheduled.
obviously black. I wouldn't know you that your
You know
dad.
what? You're right. I shouldn't say obviously. What am I talking about?
Yeah, we have these conventions. We do that, and there
That's
wasn't
true.
anything.
It's true.
You weren't. There was nothing about that that was indicated some unconscious bias. It's just we kind of say these things because it's just what you say.
It's true. You're right. Thank you for pointing that out. That's very true. I slipped into that. But anyway, his surgery was scheduled for 4 months later. So this was like in what, January of 2020. So he wasn't going to get surgery until like May. Anyway, his doctor, who was white, realized his condition was really serious, and he advocated. I mean, not just advocated, he fought to get my father's surgery accelerated. So he ended up getting surgery the second week in February in 2020. And you know what happened right after that? The lockdowns began shortly after. He's in Los Angeles, where they locked down hard at UCLA.
He was fortunate.
That's it. He was fortunate. And Rick, I often reflect upon the fact that if my father's surgeon, again, who's white, if he hadn't advocated for him, my father probably wouldn't be alive today. And I should also say that as a Black woman, I can say that I've never felt the quality of my health, quality of my health care has ever been compromised. Again, I'm a lawyer. I'm, in a higher class than many other people of color, but still. But I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute, because I know that I hope there are other people out there who have different perspectives and who probably want to ask this question. I'm wondering if it's possible that structural racism in the form of food deserts in urban communities, and the fact that low income produces poor diets, and a lot of people of color have low income, might these be producing these kinds of bad outcomes for Black patients that these studies are alleging? I mean, that seems to me to be a different issue than white surgeons just using less skill or care when operating on patients of color. But I also think we know that there realistically is racism and sexism and homophobia and all these isms everywhere in society. Are we confident that every surgeon honors his or her Hippocratic oath? Do you think? Or
the simple answer to that question is absolutely not. Surgery is a human endeavor. We are flawed human beings that practice surgery. To say that there's no racism in surgery, I think, is as wrong as saying that surgery is infused with racism. Mm-hmm. There are going to be surgeons, just like there are people in any large organization, that have prejudices and biases. Mm-hmm. My point is that to say that this is a systemic or a structural problem, that it is built into the system, that the system, the policies, the practices, the rules and regulations of the ACS are such that they advance the cause of racism and racist, outcomes. To say that is despicable. It's completely insupportable. Yeah, you're going to find, we're going to have racism with us until, the second coming. I mean, we're not going to get rid of it in human beings. It's going to be there. But one of the things that the ACS adopted, which has been perfectly definitively disproven, is this idea of implicit bias. The implicit association test was devised to try to detect unconscious bias and prejudices in people. Mm-hmm. And what they say is that implicit bias is the prejudices that we harbor that we're not even aware of, that affect how we deal with others, especially others of different, races and minorities. And they have disproven that over and over again. And yet the ACS persists in teaching about implicit bias and courses on implicit bias, as though surgeons are going to practice differently because of their prejudices. I would submit that even the racist surgeon, honestly, is probably going to do the best they can for the patient in front of them, because it's so ingrained in everything that we do. I mean, it's anathema to a surgeon to try to practice in a way that does not honor the oath that we all take. Disparities can be due to so many things. Yes, it could be, single parent households, communities where they don't have access to healthy, to healthy food, drug use and that sort of thing. There are definitely racial differences in people, medically speaking. Mm-hmm. We don't go worry about sickle cell disease in white European patients. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, we just don't. It's just not, you don't see that. I see a patient with Dupuytren's contracture, and I can immediately, without even looking at the patient, I can tell you that patient's probably going to be of Northern European extraction. So race and ethnicity all come into play in medicine. To ignore that is to ignore medicine. But to say that because Blacks are doing poorly, it's the racist thing without looking at what's happening behind the scenes, all the other, cultural, social, genetic issues that come into play and how people do after surgery. Blacks don't do as well with respect to kidney disease and dialysis. That's something that I learned from Dr. Goldfarb's book. And so you have to treat, kidney disease in Blacks differently than you do kidney disease in whites. It's a genetic thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not good or bad, it simply is.
Yeah.
So, we're supposed to practice evidence-based medicine, and to do this in a manner that puts science foremost, puts excellence in the practice of medicine foremost. And for us to start diluting our mission as surgeons in the ACS to become social justice warriors is not only wrong, I think it's misguided, it's wrong, it dilutes the mission, and I think it dilutes the quality of care, because if we start pushing for more and more surgeons in surgery and the numbers just aren't there, you're not going to get those numbers unless you start lowering the bar. And this is one of the things that I think led to the whole backlash against affirmative action, that, a lot of people that have been moved forward in affirmative action were found to have difficulty. Students in college were not doing well in the elite university because they had been selected based on affirmative action criteria that were a lowering of the bar. And we can't afford to lower the bar in surgery. It's too important.
Yeah, it's like lowering the bar in aviation or lowering the bar in the legal profession. They're just, the consequences can be devastating. One question here is, what is the difference, if any, between structural and systemic racism? In my mind, there isn't. I use them interchangeably. I don't know if you see a difference between the two, Rick, but
I do them as well. To me, structural kind of implied that I think of it as a consciously man-made thing where you actually put in, policies and procedures and rules and regulations that upholds and advance racism. And systemic racism is kind of a more organic thing where it's there. It exists. It's everywhere, it infuses everything. Anything that you do is going to have racist parameters or racist, influence because it's so infused in mankind. We're all racist, and we can't get away from that. That's the whole idea behind critical race theory, that this is a process going back to the dawn of time where we have had a constant battle between Blacks and whites with respect to one being the oppressor, one being the oppressed, and it has been that way. It's always going to be that way. That to me is systemic or a structural, is built into a system. The ACS has a system with all its bylaws and all its programs, and that is, racism is built into that. To say that to me is beyond despicable.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Another question from our viewers. Your tale is common in many professions. A couple of years ago, the state of Washington, for example, adopted legislation requiring DEI in school curricula. The California Arbitration Organization just announced the adoption of DEI. These efforts are too common to be one off each time. Do you have any idea who or what is behind this movement?
You're probably above my pay grade there. I think there definitely is a movement. I think it's, again, I did a lot of reading, so I could actually answer the question, but it would be way longer than we probably have. But it goes back to what they call the Frankfurt School, which started the whole idea of critical theory, which then morphed into, in more recent times, was adopted by people that were dealing with racism, as they took a Marxist idea of economics where you have the haves and the haves not are always fought battling each other.
Mhm.
And it becomes a revolution of the have-nots against the haves. They took that economic idea and applied race to it. So now instead of being the haves and have-not, it's the blacks versus the whites. And so this began in the universities. This was a kind of a rarefied, abstract, philosophical idea that was being taught in universities. And what happened is all these students that were learning these things graduated and went out into the society and became leaders, and began to apply some of these philosophical principles into their organizations and their jobs. And I think that began that way. I think that there is a definite I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think there's some kind of a cabal out there doing this, but I do think there's a group of people that have this very, very unique belief system, this ideology, which is almost religious. It's almost cultist the way it is, because if you are not with them, you are against them. If you are, the solution to someone who disagrees with a person who is into DEI is not to debate them, it is to cancel them and silence them. Ibram Kendi will not debate. You will never see a debate between Ibram Kendi and anybody. He will not debate anybody, because if you don't agree with his anti-racism, you are a racist. And he will not debate racists. It's a great argument. I mean, you can't beat it. How can you do better than that? If you try to get a definition of anti-racism, not to get off the subject, but you try to define anti-racism, it's not being against racism. You can't just be against racism, because that's a racist position. You have to subscribe to anti-racism. So if you ask Ibram Kendi, and I've got a YouTube somewhere on my things online, he basically says anti-racism is to do things that promote anti-racism.
It's circular.
It's a classic circular argument. I mean, the most basic debate student in high school could tear that apart. And he's sitting on a stage being fawned over by people and giving this out as his definition of anti-racism is anything that advances anti-racist equity is anti-racist. It's crazy. But yes, I think there's definitely a movement out there. There are people that believe this with all their heart. It has infected, Monica, everything. It's everywhere. Every medical school, I don't know if there's an exception. Every medical school requires their applicants to submit a diversity statement. Say, how have you advanced DEI? And what we're doing is forcing students to lie, to admit to something that they may not agree with, simply to get admission to medical school. This is what they do in places like China and Russia, where they force people to make declarations, in support of the state that they themselves don't believe. I mean, it's one of the horrible things about totalitarian systems, where you're forced to say things that you don't believe. This is happening. Universities are doing this. Medical schools are doing it. Residencies are doing this. They select residents in part based on interviews, but in part based on their required diversity statement. So yes, there's not a place in our country where you don't get DEI popping up anymore.
It's almost like we've all been bewitched or something. We're under a spell. It's crazy. Well, not all of us, but a good portion of us.
I think it reached critical mass. I think it was a slow process. And I think a couple of things, Michael Brown, his killing on the heels. Sure. Then George Floyd on the heels of that, basically fueled this tremendously. There was and the COVID lockdowns, I think, did a lot to do that. I mean, people were basically just, locked in and not able to do anything. And when these things came out, I mean, how crazy was it that they were rioting and people had to be in their homes and masked when they go out, and yet it was okay to go out and riot in the street because
exactly.
And COVID didn't count there. You didn't have COVID if you were riding the streets in support of the George Floyd protests. So it's kind of nuts right now.
It's interesting you mentioned the lockdowns. I often wonder if the psychological traumatization actually affected people's ability to think. There's some lingering impact on our critical thinking skills after being locked down for so long. because the timing is interesting. Things really went off the rails and made us very susceptible to DEI after the lockdowns.
I think we have a country that's experiencing PTSD. I really,
yes, it does seem that way.
I
It
think
really
we were
does.
traumatized. I know people personally that still wear masks. They're
Yeah.
still fearful of COVID. There are people that will get every booster that comes out because they're so afraid of COVID.
So
They don't
scary.
pay attention to any of the data, which says that basically COVID is now cold.
Yeah.
There are people pushing for children to get vaccinated when there's abundant proof that there's no justification for that. So yes, I think the country has been traumatized, and again, conspiracy theories. Maybe that was some of the intent. Maybe that was part of the reason why they did things the way they did, was to show that we can be controlled.
It can be good. Let me ask you something. See, I'm a firm believer that nothing occurs in a vacuum. And did you notice a shift away from evidence-based medicine prior to 2019? Or is this was just a sudden break from medical reality? Did you see any clues?
Not really, no.
Hmm.
No. I really can't say not a general trend that way. You know, we've always had, you know, the anti-vaxxers, we've always had the people that have, you know, the big pharma conspiracy theorists, and we've always
Mhm.
had, you know, I look back, you know, I'm old enough to know about Laetrile. I don't know if you remember Laetrile.
I don't
Uh,
think I.
it was something made from apricot pits that was being
Hmm.
used to cure cancer. And you know, people were the U.S. was not approving of Laetrile, and so the idea was we had a big conspiracy by medicine, organized medicine, to protect our turf against something like Laetrile, and continue using our dangerous chemotherapy drugs. So people were in droves going across to Mexico to get Laetrile in these clinics and so forth. So there have been a lot of issues, and of course that was disproven. Nobody even talks about Laetrile anymore. You know, throughout the years, people have the autism vaccine connection, which was so prominent in the news. So those things have always been out there. But what I think has been the worst part of the recent 3 years, I think, and this is where I think the ACS is really done a bad thing. There's been a tremendous loss in trust
Hmm.
between the general population and the medical community. I mean, people, they still tend to trust their doctors, but they don't tend to trust medicine.
Interesting.
They're very suspicious. Now they wonder about, you know, these treatments. You know, the FDA was calling ivermectin a horse tranquilizer. We shouldn't be taking it, completely ignoring the incredible human benefits of ivermectin for decades. So yes, there's been tremendous loss in trust in medicine. And now what we have is you have an organization like the ACS flat out telling people that there is racism in surgery, and you might be better off if your surgeon is the same race as you are. So imagine you're in the emergency room, you've had an accident, or you have a flaring up appendix, and in walks the surgeon, and he's a different race than you are. I mean, are you supposed to think, oh my God, you know, is this guy going to give me the best possible care? You know, and the doctor's thinking, what's this? How does this patient see me? Is he going to follow my instructions? Is he going to do what I tell him to do? Or is he going to assume the worst of me because of me being different than he is? So, I mean, we've come just, we were doing so well with our progress with respect to race relationships, and we've taken them back 50 plus years now. We're back to Jim Crow area as far as you know. We have segregated dorms for colleges. We have segregated graduation ceremonies in colleges. I mean, what is that all about? You know, the whole idea was that, you know, you eliminated these things. You're not trying to go back to that again, and yet here we are.
Yeah, it's regressive.
Unbelievably regressive, and the ACS is in it lock, stock, and barrel.
We have I'm looking at a couple of questions that are two that are related to each other. I'm going to sort of combine them. One is, would those who believe that Black patients are better served by Black surgeons also believe that white patients would be better served by white surgeons? And the second question related to that is, if racism is intrinsic, do non-white surgeons treat white patients differently? Or does this only go one way? I think we all know the answer, but do you suppose the college ever investigates this, or why do they push it only one way? It's interesting.
Well,
Or did they ever discuss it any other way?
if you're going to be consistent, you'd have to say that, because the even though the racism is being the gun of racism is pointed at whites, no question, because we're whites. Me. I'm an old heterosexual white guy. I'm a cisgendered heterosexual white guy that's clueless. So yes, we are the most deplorable demographic that exists right now. People like myself, and so the gun's pointed at us, and we're the ones that are being demonized. But yeah, even Kendi admits that he has racist thoughts and racist ideas and racist. So everyone's racist. If everyone's a racist, no one's a racist. I mean, really, truly, how can you make that argument? They even argue against being colorblind. Being colorblind is a racist thing to do. Now, I don't believe in being colorblind. I mean, I can see that you're not white. I mean, it's obvious as anything could possibly be. What I want to do is be able to see that you're not white and not have to worry that, because it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't make any difference to me what color you are. It doesn't matter to me if you're yellow and you have an Asian face. I mean, I see it, I accept it. I may apply that if I'm seeing you for a medical problem. I may apply that information, but it's not going to make any difference in how I judge you as a person, or I treat you as a patient. And that's where the horrible aspect of it is we've raised race to be, in some respects, the most important single thing about an individual. I mean, they are part of that. And if you're Black, you're like every other Black. You're not unique. Blacks are a demographic. They're an identity group. And here's what's interesting is look at all the Blacks that disagree with the DEI and anti-racism, and what happens to them? They're demonized because they're not really Black.
Well, that's led me to a question here that's along those lines.
Sure.
This person says, Monica, as a white person, I find it extraordinarily painful to be attacked as racist, transphobic, etc. when I even ask a question about the current entrenched ideologies of the radical left. I've seen Black people, Glenn Loury, Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter come to mind, who question or challenge those ideologies, and they're savaged with the most vicious racist tropes, and even treated as if they are acting out white supremacy. Have you experienced that? And if so, how do you find the strength to tolerate it? On Facebook, I've been called a white supremacist, an enabler of white supremacist. I think any Black person, any person of color who stands up against this insanity, as I call it, is going to be obliterated, is going to be eviscerated. I've lost quite a few friends, to answer your question. I find the strength to tolerate it, just as I'm sure Rick finds the strength to tolerate it, because we're living in times, I think, when strong people are the only ones. You have to have and I know you do, Rick, you have to have this fortitude, this inner fortitude that unfortunately most people lack. And I don't know if it's an evolutionary thing or what's caused it, but my experience has been, whether we're Black, white, gay, straight, whatever, most people are not internally strong, and they will just bend with the wind. Wherever the majority is moving, that's the direction that they'll move in also. And I think what's really disappointing is that when the people we entrust with our lives, whether it's a litigation, whether we're flying in a commercial airliner, whether we're undergoing surgery, we don't expect the people with such important responsibilities to be ones that don't think, to be the ones who just blow with the wind. We expect them to be strong. And I think we're finding out that these people aren't very strong. And that's frightening. It's really frightening. Okay.
Racist. I was called racist many times during my comment thread. I don't know how much time we have left, Monica.
Oh, we have about half an hour, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I believe we do.
Just a couple. It's just my background is interesting because I am half Brazilian. My mother was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro. My father was born and raised in Minnesota. And when my mother came to this country, she was married my dad and came to Florida. And this was back in the 1940s, late 40s and 50s. and it was still segregated. If you went to public areas, there were white and black water fountains, white and black restrooms, public restrooms. And my mother couldn't believe this because Brazil was not. It was not that way in Brazil. And it's funny, I guess I get some of this from her because she made it a point to always use the black restrooms and the black water fountains. She would not use the white ones. That was her. I'm sure if she'd been in Birmingham, she would have been with Rosa Parks in the front of that bus, refusing to move to the back. So I was raised in a household where race did not matter. We were raised to accept the dignity of every human being as a child of God, and that's what we were supposed to see when we saw another person. What was I going to say? It's just, sometimes I get so much in my mind at one time that it's hard to figure out where to go from there. But you said something that caught my attention about anyway.
Well, as it turns out, we only have a couple minutes. I'm sorry. I thought we were going to 6:30. We're only going to
well, good. I don't have anything.
Oh, well, you know what? I have one last question, and here it is. I hope you can answer in a couple minutes. So when I hear about your experience of the complete disregard for evidence or data supporting these changes in medical practices, I can't help but reflect on the lack of critical thinking we're seeing that's impacting doctors in other areas. For example, gender-affirming care for minors, which I think many of us can agree doesn't have a lot of evidence to support it, especially in terms of long-term safety. But I'm also wondering if this lack of critical thinking we're seeing is impacting, I don't know, even the way we approach vaccination. You touched on the COVID pandemic. So is the muzzling of dissent against race essentialism, it sounds a lot like the silencing of doctors who've expressed concerns about the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine. Just curious before we leave, what are your thoughts on that, if you have any?
Well, without going into the thing about the COVID vaccines is the U.S. government and the public health agencies, starting from Tony Fauci on down, adopted a one-size-fits-all, top-down approach to vaccination. There was no nuance and no context. So they have the same recommendations, whether you're an 80-year-old elderly fragile person in a nursing home or a healthy 4 or 5-year-old child in a nursery school. All of you need to be vaccinated. Okay, so there is no, and the evidence, I mean, there is a 1,000-fold difference in the risk of COVID between a young child and an elderly adult. And yet they approach the problem as though it's a one-size-fits-all. So yes, there is an absolute lack of critical thinking. Now, whether this is deliberate, and unless you think these people are stupid, which I don't believe they are, then there's obviously something else going on that makes them do these things that have no evidence behind them if you think critically for just a moment. I had COVID before I got vaccinated. And once I had COVID, I wasn't going to get vaccinated, not because I'm anti-vax, but because I believe in something that I learned back in medical school, and that is natural immunity. And it's served me quite well so far. The last thing I know what I wanted to say before is that this made me a bit uncomfortable because it was titled Profiles in Courage. I don't like to think of myself as a courageous person. I honestly don't have as much to lose as many people do. I'm at the end of my career. Nobody can fire me from my job. If you want to label me. I don't care. It rolls off my back. But there are a lot of people that think like I do and are fearful. They can't speak up because they work in a job where if they speak up, they risk losing their job. I couldn't believe this. Before I was blocked from my private messages, I got many messages from minority, Black and white surgeons saying that they agreed with me, but they felt they could not speak up because it would jeopardize their careers in academia and medical centers and so forth. I'm thinking, what did we come to when a surgeon, I mean, we're pretty darn confident, brash individuals who speak our mind, when we're fearful of speaking up because it's going to cost us our career. That's crazy. So no, I don't have a lot of courage. I just don't have a lot to lose.
You know what? I'm hearing from our moderator, excuse me, my IT person here, that we can actually, let's go for another, if you guys don't mind sticking around for another 10 or so minutes, get a little more from the good doctor. Let's see if we have a few more questions. Let's see. And for some people join late, so I think it might be helpful if you do it. Just a slight recap here. For people who missed the first part of this webinar, Rick, did you get a response from the college to your letter? Can you just recap that for people who might have come late?
No, a formal letter under the letterhead of Do No Harm, an organization, was sent to the Board of Regents of the ACS, demanding my reinstatement because of the reasons why I was banned. I think they went, as they say, a bridge too far in demanding that I get an apology. I don't care for an apology. I just want to get reinstatement. I'm not looking to embarrass the ACS. I'm not looking to necessarily make waves just for the sake of making waves. But I think this is the discussion that needs to be had. And no, there's been no response to the letter that was sent to the ACS. I have sent multiple letters, and I know that they have been received because I have the receipt from certified mail that they were delivered. And I've never received a single response. I sent again, I'm a writer now. I sent a 6-page, single-space letter, probably overwhelmed the poor man, to Dr. Tim Eberlein, who was one of the Board of Regents, and I educated him on critical race theory. I said, you need to know this, because in our Zoom call, he was a regent on the Zoom call. He's an older man. He's older than I am. I just turned 29. No, I'm just kidding. He's an older gentleman, very respected. You know, he's a head of a surgical department or program somewhere. And I said, you need to educate yourself on this, because he made a comment during the Zoom call. And his comment was, you know, he was on the task force on racism that the ACS assembled. He was part of that whole process. And he says, you know, in all of our deliberations, I never heard the term critical race theory. And I stopped for a second. I said, how could that be? And I just stopped for one moment. Then I realized something. I said, this is what I told him. I said, you know, critical race theory infuses everything to do with DEI and anti-racism. It is the basis for these things. So think about medicine. If you go to a medical meeting or a conference on some area of medicine, you're never going to hear anybody mention the germ theory. No one mentioned the germ theory. It's accepted. It's there. It's part of it's a part of medicine. We don't have to say the words or speak it. The same thing with critical race theory. I'm a big fan of Ayan Hirsi Ali, who is a big advocate in pushing back against DEI and anti-racism and critical race theory. And she had a very excellent article in which she clearly spelled out how what happened is critical race theory became such a toxic term. People began to understand what it was, and it began to be more of an obstacle than a help to refer to this. So DEI has become the term that has replaced critical race theory. So when you say diversity, equity, inclusion, you're not talking about, you know, equity being fairness and inclusion being inclusion and diversity being variety. You're talking about a very, very specific ideology, which underlies that is critical race theory. DEI is indivisible. It's indistinguishable from critical race theory if you start looking at the premise of it, what it's all about.
Got another question. Let me ask you. Now, I and many other people have been very vocal about the issues I have with equity and how it's a very dangerous substitute for equality. I mean, a lot of people don't understand that the two terms are very distinct, quite different. And I see how equity plays out in education and a lot of other sectors. It essentially amounts to leveling the playing field by making sure, and again, in the context of education, making sure that all children receive the same level of education, even if it means the brightest students are ignored. So it essentially squeezes the caliber of education into this band of mediocrity. So I'm wondering, when I hear the word equity in healthcare, how does that play out? Was Obamacare maybe the precursor to this equity in healthcare in the sense that, when I was an executive at Viacom, I had to give up my Cadillac healthcare plan. It was a nice healthcare plan. I never began to get anything like it in the years since. So you give up our Cadillac health plan so that people without any healthcare would have plans, thereby sort of ensuring that everyone gets forced into the Ford Pinto health plan. I mean, that's maybe a bad analogy, but I'm wondering how does
not bad.
Equity?
Not bad at all.
Okay, yeah. How does equity play out in healthcare? Is my question.
I can tell you very specific examples, and that is that
Okay.
because there's a push for correcting these disparities in representation of minorities in medicine, they find that if you look at the for example, the scores, to get into medical school, you take an examination called Medical College Aptitude Test, the MCAT.
Mhm.
And they found that the scores for Black students were standards of deviation below that of white students. So instead of working and saying, okay, what can we do to bring up the scores on these Black students, we have to start, let's look at the schools. What are the schools doing? How are they failing? And things of that sort, looking at the causes behind this. What they've done is, oh, we're just going to eliminate the MedCat. We
Oh,
don't
wow.
have that anymore. And in medical school, because there was a certain pass, you have to do, have a certain pass rate in medical school to progress and to graduate and so forth. And so what they did is a lot of medical schools eliminated grades. So what happens then is now, there are residency programs that are very desirable. Mass General is a very excellent medical center, and to get a residency there in anything is considered to be a feather in your cap, and so it's very competitive. And of course, those medical schools, they want the best. They want the most excellent students. Well, how do you determine those excellent students if you haven't got any kind of a standard, a quantitative standard? If you don't have grades, you don't have rankings in class, how do you do that? And so now they go to, well, we look at the life experience, we look at what else they have done in their lives, and that's all well and good. I mean, medical schools have always, looked for students with diverse backgrounds. I mean, I saw that in my own class. We had a student who was a professional ballerina, for Pete's sakes, that went to medical school and became a doctor. But what they do is they lower the bar. They look, if the standards are too high and it's making it difficult for them to meet their quotas, and these are quotas, then they just get rid of the standard, and there you go. So now you're admitted based on your diversity statement and your lived experience, and the fact that you fit into a certain identity group that they're looking for. What's interesting is I looked into just briefly, the affirmative action came into play in 1961. I remember when there was the Bakke case, a white applicant for medical school was denied a place, even though he had better scores than other people, and that was he actually ended up getting into medical school. But it was a big challenge to affirmative action back then. But we've had affirmative action in place now for 50 years. And we're still talking about disparities. We still don't have the number of Blacks and others in medicine that supposedly would represent the demographics. Now, Asians are being discriminated against in reverse. They're doing too well. Here you have a minority that is over performing and exceeds the scores and abilities of even the white students. And this was the reason why the affirmative action was taken down by the Supreme Court was because of a lawsuit brought on by an Asian. Asians trying to get into Harvard were finding out that they were being blocked from admission to Harvard, even though they had super high scores, because there were too many of them. So, when there's no quotas, I mean, we're talking quotas in reverse now. So yes, the medicine is being definitely impacted. We have not escaped. And it's going to be a struggle to get back to merit. We have to go back to stressing, it's a bad word in some circles, but meritocracy, deserving people need to be, selected for these very, very desirable professions. We have to have a focus on excellence. We have to have competence. We have to have, obviously, people of good character. Character counts. But merit and excellence need to be put back up on top of the pyramid. And we need to kick diversity and equity and inclusion down to a lower tier. Not that we eliminate them, but we have to put them in their proper place.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Asian experience, because it seems to me that is the elephant in the room that subverts this entire systemic racism, ideology. I mean, we're talking about people, not all Asians, but Japanese Americans in particular. They were interned during World War II. I mean, we're talk about institutional racism, just like putting people behind bars simply because of their race. It's been, I have plenty of Asian American friends, second, third generation, who've told me, how difficult their experience has been, even in like urban areas. Yet now they are the beneficiaries of privilege. It makes no sense whatsoever. So we're almost out of time. I wanted to leave with just a final question I'm hoping to give, to inspire the folks who are watching now. I hope I get the answer I'm expecting. Do you get the sense that your colleagues appreciate what's happening in your profession, that they're concerned, and that they're going to be willing to stand up in the future? Or do you sense this sort of indifference or futility that's going to doom the medical profession? Which way do you see us moving?
The answer is yes.
Yes. Thank you.
I wish I could give you an answer. I get a lot of private encouragement, a lot. I get it online, I get it in emails. I get very limited public encouragement. There are very few people that are willing to step up. I know that between all the people that I contact and all the people that they must know, I know there have to be hundreds and hundreds of people that are aware of my situation by now. I mean, I've been out there, I've put this out publicly all over the place. Maybe I'm just not aware because I don't have any engagement with the ACS. I don't know of anyone that has sent a letter to the ACS demanding my reinstatement. I don't know of any kind of I have a petition out to ask for my reinstatement. I don't know of anyone that started a petition to get me reinstated. I am aware of a couple of comments online because I have friends in the ACS who send the information, people that have brought my name up and asked for me to be restored. But as far as any kind of a substantial groundswell of support for what I'm doing, no. And I'm going to do this as long as I can. I'm going to make myself as annoying and troublesome to the ACS as I possibly can for as long as I can. And if things change, then I'll be very pleased and proud and happy that I did that, because I'm not out to destroy an organization that I've been a proud member of for 30 years. But if things don't change, there may come a day when I just hang it up and say, you know what, I'm going to go off and play with the grandkids and whatnot. Right now, that's what fuels me, Monica. I have children. I have a daughter of the doctor, her husband the doctor. These are young physicians working in a system that I think is broken. I've got grandchildren coming up, and I feel like if I don't speak up, then I don't want to be someday in my life looking back saying, gee, don't I wish I had said something? Don't I wish I had done more? I want to look back and say, okay, I did as best I could with what I had to work with in my little sphere of influence, and hopefully that was enough. And if a few people will join me, it doesn't take many. I mean, a vocal minority have gotten us to where we are today. The majority of people do not believe in critical race theory. They don't believe in DEI and anti-racism. The majority do not. I absolutely, completely believe that with all my heart. But until we get a vocal minority of people that are going to aggressively and without any kind of unapologetically push back against this, I don't think it's going to change. So I have some elements of optimism and I have some elements of pessimism. So I guess I'm a little bit ambivalent.
Well, I will end by saying my mantra is I'm a short-term pessimist, but I'm a long-term optimist. And I believe that people like you and those of us in FAIR, our job, going back to what I said earlier, our job is to give courage to the weak. Because you're right, it's just a critical mass. When we reach a critical mass, that's when everything will change. And I firmly believe with all my heart that we're getting close to making that happen. I do.
I sure hope so. I do feel a groundswell is starting of pushing back. I'm hopeful that's going to continue.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you everyone else for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And hopefully we will maybe have you back in the future, Rick, to see if there have been any developments on your case.
I would be delighted to come back with some good news. So
We'll be waiting. We'll be waiting.
I am so thankful to FAIR for providing me with this opportunity. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all. And we will see you at the next webinar. Take care.